Everyone, welcome to today's webinar on VMD54 version 1.1, estimating leakage from displacement of agricultural activities. We'll get started here shortly. Want to give everyone a chance to get on the webinar and get situated. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start. So looks like we have the recording started, and just want everyone to know that this session will be recorded and then will be uploaded to Verra's website if you want to go back and watch any of it to help answer questions, or if you want to share it with others, please feel free to do so. I am Spencer Plum. I'm Senior Manager of Forest Carbon Innovation, and am joined today by Emilio Villanova, who's Senior Program Officer of Forest Carbon Innovation, and Katie Gossley, Director of Forest Carbon Innovation, also at Verra. So we're really happy to have everyone joining this session. Like I said at the top, we're going to discuss VMD54, our leakage module for ARR and agricultural methodologies. We've released a new version of this. The 1.1 version was released back in January of 2026. And we've been working on this revision since April of 2024. We started with a public comment version, got a lot of good feedback, and have continued to get input from groups like the Abacus Working Group, Scott Settlemyer of Terra Carbon, and Kyle Hemes of Amazon, along with a lot of public input and inquiries from stakeholders. So a lot of what you see here today is in response to the questions that we're getting, and then where we see that there are gaps or areas that need more clarity, we've tried to integrate that into this version update, and we'll continue to work on that as we see issues come up. We'll look for opportunities to do further updates, but for now, this is the active version of VMD54. So today's presentation, we'll walk through the summary of the major changes and highlight some of the clarifications that have also been included. You'll note that when you look at the two documents, there is quite a bit of reorganization that happened, and that's primarily just to make it easier to read, but there are some substantive changes that were made. We also will walk through VMD54 sort of in a step-by-step process so you can see the major components. And while we do that, we'll spotlight some of these changes that have been made that are substantive. And then we'll wrap up with question and answer. So please feel free to add your questions. We will post the questions that we answer. And unfortunately, we don't have the hand raise feature available on this version of Zoom. So if you do have questions, please drop them into the chat and we will get to as many as we can. Hopefully we have some time at the end, and I expect that we will. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So first, I think it's important to discuss what is leakage. So the purpose of VMD54 is basically to assess what greenhouse gas emissions might occur outside of the project area where we don't have a specific accounting boundary. when there's implementation of project activities that reduce or halt prior productive land use. So we're really focused in this module on land use and those activities that, if they were to be replaced somewhere else, are likely going to cause some sort of emissions, and that would likely be happening through land clearing. And so that's what we're trying to capture with this leakage module. The module accounts for displacement of these pre-project activities that are agricultural related. And so that can include crops. It would also include things like grazing, so cattle or other livestock. And then we also include fuelwood collection, as that could potentially be a land use activity that also needs to be considered if there's a project, an ARR project, or agriculture project happening in one of these locations. What we try and do is basically capture those changes by looking back at a historic rate of production of those commodities and then forecasting that as our baseline. And then with that framework, we can then assess a quantity of leakage that would be likely to be displaced. And that includes both the market and activity shifting. So we're kind of looking at those forms of leakage all as one group. We're not specifying exactly where that leakage might happen. We're just trying to capture as much of that based on actual production in the past and projection of what that production might look like into the future. And then I think another unique piece of this methodology or module is that we account for activities like leakage mitigation that can reduce that overall displaced production. So this is a way to kind of claw back some of the displaced production or leakage that is going to occur and reduce that overall leakage deduction from projects. So where possible, projects choose to do this, projects may implement leakage mitigation activities. So that's sort of the overview of high-level overview of what we're working with in VMD54. Some of the significant changes that we want to note for this revision are that we've added what we're referring to as cross-commodity production leakage accounting. So basically what this allows for projects to do is introduce new commodities into the project area that are agriculture related or could be grazing or growing crops in either agroforestry systems or silvopasture systems. And we want to account for that as a form of leakage mitigation. So we are going to recognize that there is new production taking place within the project that would not have occurred if not for the project, and that production is likely preventing some amount of land outside of the project area from being cleared to create that production. So we have introduced the accounting mechanisms for this, and we will walk through what that looks like here shortly. We also have added equations for leakage mitigation emissions. So this is basically a step to make sure that our leakage mitigation is explicit and really clear. We had language in the previous version that pointed to this, but we did not have the equation. So this is an addition that hopefully helps make it easier to understand what is required and how to account for those emissions from leakage mitigation activities. And then we have also added the ability to justify that if there is displacement of project activities, but there is either very low forest cover or very, very low rates of deforestation, that it may be likely that displacement of agriculture does not result in deforestation. We do have to assume that it's going to result in some sort of land degradation. So we would look to the next most common native ecosystem type to understand what that change in carbon stock because of displaced activities is going to look like. So we'll also take a look at that sort of in situ here in a second. I also want to note a couple minor changes and clarifications that we've added. A lot of this is really just related to making sure that when folks read the methodology, they have the same understanding that we have. So we've tried to make our language more clear and on all of these topics. And so the first is just this 5-year accounting. So this was already in the last version of VMD0054. And it basically says we want to account for leakage for 5 years from any single instance. So where there's just instances enrolled in 1 year, you would have 5 years of leakage accounting that you are required to assess. For grouped projects or projects that are enrolling instances across years, you're going to have different amount or different lengths of leakage accounting based on when those instances enrolled. So the first instances will go for 5 years from when the most recent instance was added. So you can imagine a project that starts at time 0, adds instances and has goes for 5 years or goes for 3 years, adds other instances, and those new instances will have a 5-year accounting window, and those original instances will have an 8-year accounting window for leakage. And so that's just a means to capture the displacement of those pre-project land activities and make sure we have accounting for just this continued land use change driver that may be taking place. We feel like that's a conservative way to do it, and at the end, we'll talk about how these are only accounting for incremental changes. These additional years account for incremental changes. We're not assuming that there is a change in or displacement of land use every single year. So the effects on the total amount of leakage are maybe less impactful than folks have raised in questions for us. And that kind of speaks to this next point on this clarification of incremental changes. So we have these 5-year windows. First, we capture the displacement of that land use, but that is really just captured once. So if you had, in our example, we'll talk about 100 head of cattle that are going to be displaced. We assume that displacement of 100 head of cattle results in land use change just one time. And then any incremental change thereafter is just reflecting that rate of increased productivity that we are assuming that will occur based on baseline productivity. So we're not assuming that every single year a new 100 head of cattle are being displaced and land being cleared for them. So that's something that's, I think, really important to note for the accounting in this leakage module, and you'll see some of that as we walk through. We've also updated the de minimis requirements. So leakage is going to be required for most of these ARR projects. Basically, anytime there is productive land use prior to implementation of a project, then you're going to have some sort of leakage calculation that's required. You'd have to provide strong evidence that there is really no productive land use occurring on the project site prior to the project. We've also expanded the applicability of this leakage module, as I've sort of hinted at in the intro here, to apply to VM42 and VM32 as allowed by those methodologies. So that will be something you'll need to look at in the version of VM42 and 32 that you're using. But essentially, since we're working in agricultural lands, we feel like this leakage module could be applied to those other project activities that are occurring on agricultural lands. And then we've, like I said, tried to clean up some of the discrepancies and added some definitions to make sure everything is consistent. So you'll see that throughout the document. So I want to provide just this overview of the steps of how we quantify leakage in VMD54, and then we'll talk about where some of these changes are made. So we first start with quantifying these changes in production. So this involves looking back at a historical period to understand what the baseline of production was. We also would account for any sort of monitored production. We're then moving to quantify leakage mitigation. This uses a similar structure. There is a historic look back period for what production has been, and then demonstrating that through your leakage mitigation activity, you would be increasing that production of that product within a defined area. Then we're combining those and moving that over to determine what's the impact on land. So basically, how many hectares of land are being impacted. There's some default assumptions that are used here, and we'll talk about those. And then we're going from land to carbon stock. So we're estimating a carbon stock change based on predominant land types or forest type in the project area. And then we're using that change in carbon stock and area to determine overall leakage emissions. So that's the basic flow. You'll see this, this little diagram at the top to indicate what phase or what part of what step we're at as we walk through the different changes. And so just note that these will be lit up at the top and indicate that for you. We'll talk about the cross-commodity production accounting, both in the first quantifying changes and then how it affects determining land impacts. We'll talk about this leakage mitigation emissions in the quantifying leakage mitigation. And then Amelia will join us to talk about land cover assumptions when we get to carbon stock change. And then we'll wrap things up with just an overview of an equation map and then a very short, very simplified example to just kind of document a little bit of what we've been going through on the presentation. So here are the equations that we are using to look at quantifying changes in production. We're starting again with our baseline production and looking at a historical time period to understand what the likely production was, and then increasing that again incrementally by looking at this rate of increased productivity, this RJ feature. So this sets our baseline and is basically what we're monitoring against when we look at leakage. Then we have our equation for monitoring, understanding what the project, at least for the same commodity type, is continuing to produce. So we could imagine a project that has displaced some cattle, but is maintaining some cattle as well. We want to compare that monitored production of cattle to our historic baseline production of cattle that's now being projected into the future. And that's how we are going to look at our displaced production. And that's basically what's happening here in equation 3 is our change in production, our baseline production. Our change in production is baseline production minus monitored production. So some of the changes that I think are worth noting are that we start looking at this cross-commodity production here in our monitored production. So let's say that in addition to having some cattle production when they started or prior to the project is now adding avocados to their ARR project as part of the project activity. We would be considering that a new commodity, and for all cross-commodity projects, it needs to be a new commodity. We wouldn't be considering an existing commodity as a cross-commodity. You already have it, you just need to keep monitoring it. So where we add a new commodity like avocados here, we just add that in, and we're gonna look at the overall production from the project area over time. Our baseline is gonna be 0 because that commodity did not exist. And so this just adds to what we're monitoring in the project in terms of productivity. We've changed this term foregone production in version 1 to change in production to reflect that these values, especially for cross commodity, might be positive or negative. So in this case, positive means leakage. Negative means you're reducing, basically you're reducing leakage. You're minimizing the amount of land that would be displaced. And we'll look at how that all gets summed together. And then I think we've covered this last one. The continued production of an existing commodity is just monitored. It's not a cross commodity. So that all remains the same, but important to kind of see how those things fit together. So then with our change in production, we see that show up here in equation 6, and we'll come back to it. I just want to note that that is there. Now we're looking at quantifying our leakage mitigation. So we would basically do the same exercise. We'd look at a historic rate of production of a leakage mitigation area. So we're establishing this baseline in production of, in this case, it could be cattle, but it's cattle outside of the project area. These need to be commodities that are being increased or affected that are not within the project area. And so we're going to look at that rate of production. It's also important to note here that for leakage mitigation, we're not allowing projects to introduce new commodities. So you would have to be looking for ways to increase cattle production outside the project area. You could not be introducing something like avocado production if it was not already occurring in the project area prior to implementation of the project. So that's one distinction between leakage mitigation and the cross-commodity leakage. So we set our baseline, then we are observing our monitored production of leakage, and we're taking our monitored production minus the baseline production to get our leakage mitigation value, and then we combine our leakage mitigation with our change in production. And so again, we could note here that these values might end up being negative. If the change in production, however, is fairly large, then we would be, again, reducing that through leakage mitigation activities. That gives us LJT, and we'll look at that here in a second on the next slide. I also want to note that here we have added these equations 7 and 8 to account for emissions from things like fertilizer or fossil fuel use due to mitigation activities. And so these tack on at the very final equation, but important to note that we're explicitly accounting for these. And we have a provision in the module that says basically if there are other emissions, for example, like land use change, that you would have to account for those emissions. I want to note that for leakage mitigation, we would not allow projects to do leakage mitigation activities that clear native forest or any sort of native ecosystem. Essentially, those emissions are going to be greater than any sort of leakage mitigation that could come from that. So we want to just state that upfront and explicitly that that is not allowed. But if there are other sources of emissions like clearing vegetation, non-native vegetation or something, you would need to account for that as well. And we point you to VM47 Appendix 2 to look at the significance of what emissions need to be included. And I think that captures all the significant changes for leakage mitigation. So now we're taking our production and figuring out basically how much of what that means in terms of land area. And so we're going to do that by looking at how much of our production is replaced by an increase in supply, and then how much of that increase in supply comes from new lands. And so that's what this equation 9 is doing. So we see the amount of production, the displaced production that we have, our increased supply, and then our new lands. And then that's all divided by our average production values. So we've updated this to be GJT in the module. So when you see that, this is a value that you'll need to input and find data to support. Basically, it says, this is the average amount of production for the region that we're working in. And so that's going to give us a total amount of land that is likely to be displaced or reduced because of project activities. And then we're going to bring that over and sum that all together here in equation 10. So you could imagine that you have different commodities, maybe it's cattle and then avocados. Again, you could imagine that your cattle value is positive and that your avocado value is negative. And we're going to sum those together, and that's where you're going to see the reduction in overall land that's required to be or assumed to be displaced. So that's where that accounting occurs. I think the other component that's important to note here is that we do have some assumed values for IS and NL, and I want to just look at those briefly. We've added this table into the leakage module. Previously, we allow projects to assume leakage only displaced value for IS and NL. And so those values are right now just set at 75% and 40%. If you are a project developer that wants to do the research and look into or has access to data that would suggest a different value for increased share and the new lands being brought into production, you may propose that. That is, these are optional values to use, but you would need to support something that's different than the default values. The change that we have made is that for cross-commodity production, we're just going to assume that the increased supply and the new lands brought into production for both sides of that equation are going to be 100%. So that gives us a way to be very conservative. So if you're displacing cattle, we're going to assume that 100% of that cattle is made up in the market, and 100% of that leads to deforestation. And the same would be true for cross commodity, that if you're introducing avocados, that you're displacing 100% of avocado production somewhere else or for that amount, and then that would lead to 100% reduction in deforestation for that amount of the commodity. So that we feel like is at least paired and conservative, and would allow projects to take a look at cross commodity production and make sure that any sort of difference that they're seeing is likely going to be accounted conservatively. I'll note that this cross commodity production is tied to our abacus label. And so these are values that are also required in the abacus label. And so projects that are using cross-commodity production are likely to be using the abacus label anyway. And so this is where we feel like the values align with the requirements of the label. So that's where those values are tied to external to this module. So once we have the amount of land that is likely to be displaced, we are going to look at changes in carbon stock. And so that means looking at basically the average carbon stock values for forested land in a country. Our update on this is that we are allowing projects now to justify that there are situations in which it's very unlikely that deforestation is going to happen because of these projects. And again, you'd have to look at the next most common native ecosystem type that's likely to be displaced. You're not getting to set these to zero. There's some other value that replaces that. And I'll turn it over to Emilio real briefly to talk through those instances and what that looks like, the evidence that we're looking for to justify that forests may not be replaced because of displacement. Emilio, over to you.
Thanks, Spencer. Hello, everybody. You can move to the next, Spencer. So in step 4 of the module, we have so the module assumes that the new land brought into production is forest, unless the project is able to demonstrate at least two things. One, that the project is located in a region with very low forest cover, or that the forest land is effectively protected or unlikely to be converted. So for this, we are proposing using well-known resource and data, which is a Global Forest Watch, to estimate whether the country where the project is located has a very low forest cover. You can go one back, Spencer, and then in this example, we are using Kenya as an example, where in Global Forest Watch estimate that the land cover, at least 4% of the land cover in Kenya is just natural forests. So there's definitely an example. There are examples out there that can be found with countries with very low forest cover, less than 10%. Similarly, with Global Forest Watch, you can go to the next, Spencer. The module stipulates to that countries could have a very low deforestation rates. In this example, a project has a start date of 2022, and then you have a 10-year look-back period using Global Forest Watch, where you can find that, in this case, in Guyana, in South America, that this country has a particular very low deforestation rate, less than 0.1% per year. If any of those conditions are met, then the project proponent may proceed using identifying the relevant ecoregion where the project is located, and then estimate the change in biomass carbon stocks for all significant carbon pools. Where these conditions are not met, then the project must assume that the new land brought into production is actual forest land. And that means that the change in biomass carbon stocks in the area that is generating leakage assumes a complete loss of above ground and below ground biomass that would later, depending on which pool is considered significant. Spencer?
Thanks, Emilio. Appreciate that. So to wrap all this up together, I wanted to provide the schematic of how all these equations basically fit. And what we're looking at here is this determining the leakage emission. So this is everything that we've just walked through. So you're taking this change in carbon stock, you're multiplying it by the area of land that is assumed to be displacing, taken up by displacement of production. We're adding in our leakage emissions from leakage mitigation activities if they occur, and we sum all that up in this final box here. And so, yeah, I hope that's a useful schematic. While we're on this, I want to note that we've gotten a lot of requests for spreadsheets to help document this and provide more clarity. And we're really close to releasing a digital version of this. And so projects will then should be able to use that, the digitized version, to basically run these calculations and look at different scenarios. And so we're excited to get that out to allow projects to kind of do an ex-ante assessment of leakage mitigation activities, and it'll have all these components baked into it. So you could look at leakage mitigation or cross commodity and understand how that's going to affect your overall leakage. So something to note that's, I think, exciting and important for projects that are trying to wrap their arms around leakage. And then finally, I want to just provide this example of a very simplified look at what leakage could look like, just to point out a couple of things. So one, I have color coded just the different values that we would expect to see. So this is based on 100 head of cattle assumed in our, that would be lost based on historic production. And you see these numbers gradually increasing. This is based on the default value of 2.5% of increasing productivity over time. And these are obviously just rounded up. So we see this amount of total leakage that we're gonna have to account for. I wanna note that these do not get summed up. We're just looking at any given year, what is the amount of leakage that you would have responsible for if you were to credit. So if you were to credit in year one, you would be starting out your assumptions by saying, I would be responsible for 103 cattle. By year 5, has increased to 113 cattle. So a total increase of 13 head of cattle from your baseline production. It would not be the sum of these, which would be, well above 500 head of cattle. That is not how we're doing the leakage accounting in this case. We're just saying we assume that it increases because of this rate of production, and you see this, the total amount in year 5. That's where you would stop your leakage accounting. That's the number of cattle that you'd be responsible for trying to displace on the land, or through leakage, or through leakage mitigation. So let's just walk that through. So our change in production in this case in year 5 would be 113 head of cattle. Our production subject to leakage is 113, basically because we didn't have any leakage mitigation and we didn't have any cross commodity production showing up. Then we have these increased share or increased supply and new lands at 75% and 40%. And then our regional commodity yield is 1.7 cattle per hectare. And so that's what we're going to divide by in that case. And then we're getting to the amount of new land brought into production. So that would be, based on that calculation, 20 hectares. So that ends up being our land that we're area subject to leakage. And then we're multiplying that by carbon stock of the forest type. And that includes both biomass and soil. And then that gives us a total leakage value at year 5 of 10,487 tons CO2e that we are responsible for deducting from our project. So I want to note that let's say you are running this project and you want to credit in year 2, and you have 20,000 carbon removals that you're going to issue. Your leakage deduction in year 2 is going to be 9,721 tons that you are going to deduct from your carbon removals. Obviously, there are other things happening in VM47 equations, but just to simplify this, that means that you'd be getting credited for 10,279 tons or credits coming out of that project, because you're taking most of that leakage, right, for the 100 head of cattle in year 2. If you go back and credit in year 5, you're going to have a much lower leakage deduction because you've already taken the bulk of this. You've already taken responsibility for, in year 2, 105 head of cattle. So by year 5, you're only taking responsibility for the incremental increase of 8 head of cattle. So that would represent 765 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that you're responsible for in leakage. And so that would be deducted from your additional 20,000 tons of carbon removal. So you can kind of see here how these stack together. We refer to them as cumulative in the LKT equation, but we've noted that has tripped some folks up, and there's some confusion about that. So it is not annual, but it is cumulative based on the incremental increases in leakage over the project, over the first 5 years of the project. So hopefully that helps, and we expect that there will probably be questions, but hopefully with the equations and digitized version of this, we can point folks to that, and you'll get a grasp of that once you kind of see it and can run through it. So happy to get that out there, and now take questions on any of the changes that we've seen in this presentation.
Thanks, Spencer. We have received a few questions. I've tried to answer some of them. So I think there are a few that would be good to answer live. So we can start with a question from Adam. He asks, what's the rationale for including alternative commodities in the cross-commodity leakage reduction, but not the leakage mitigation? It seems like the logic might be inconsistent.
Yeah, so we're trying, this is an innovation, something new that we're putting out there. And so we wanted to start with what we knew we could look at in the project area and account for all of the emissions from that. I agree that there's learning to be done, and it may be that we eventually look and see if cross-commodity production could occur outside of the project area. But for now, we feel like with the accounting boundary of the project area, we can actually get pretty good value or a pretty good assessment of the amount of emissions that are being that are associated with introducing new crops, and also allowing for projects or encouraging those projects to include agricultural production. We see that as a good thing. So we want those projects to be able to account for that additional benefit, and be able to do that as sort of an incentive to have more food and carbon removal as an outcome of projects being implemented. Thanks,
Spencer. We have a question here from Stephen Klosterman. I'm going to read it. If fuelwood extraction is a displaced production, an agroforestry plot for sustainable fuelwood harvest will be established within the project area boundary to reduce displaced fuelwood production. Does this count as cross-commodity production? Based on your comments, Spencer, Stephen seems to say that, like, if production of the same commodity will be introduced somewhere, it must be outside the project area and then will be called leakage mitigation activities as opposed to cross-commodity production.
Yeah, I think I understand the question to be if they are introducing fuel wood, it would be, if that's not occurring currently, but it will happen in the project moving forward, then it would be cross-commodity. If it's already happening, then you could monitor the continued production of fuel wood, and then you could also potentially do establish new areas of fuel wood production and account that as leakage mitigation. But in that case, it wouldn't be cross-commodity because it was already something that was being produced.
Thank you, Spencer. I have a question here from Marcela. With respect to emissions associated with mitigation activities, the module indicates that these emissions may be considered de minimis in accordance with the VM47 appendix. However, the appendix specifies the leakage emission cannot be considered de minimis. Could you clarify how this condition should be interpreted?
Yeah. So leakage itself may only be deemed de minimis when you meet the requirements in VMD54. So VM47 points you to the leakage module and says, use this module. You have to use this module in all cases. There is an instance, or there are occurrences where when you're using the module, you can say there was no productive land use here, and therefore we will account this as a de minimis value. And so we would allow that where sufficient documentation is available to say there was really nothing being produced on this land prior to the project. Did I get everything in that question, Emilio?
I think so. Maybe Marcela would like to clarify if this answered the question. I think it does. Here, I have questions about the analysis of deforestation. If it would be possible to use alternative data sets to Global Forest Watch if there are higher quality data for the region. For example, there are other data sets in the Amazon like map, biomass, etc.
That's a good question. I think we would, it would be possible to use them. You'd need you may need to do a methodology deviation to just point to the data set that you're using as being more conservative or more accurate than the data set that we suggest using in the module.
Regarding again, the deforestation rate, does this have to be analyzed at a country level? The Bush says in large country, the deforestation rate may be different by state, and it would be possible to analyze the deforestation at the state level.
I think that again would be a deviation. You'd have to justify that and show that it's a conservative assessment.
Correct. Yeah. Marcela is asking, can maintaining baseline production for a period of 5 years within the project area while respecting carrying capacity, improving pasture quality, and adopting rotational production practices be considered a complete mitigation measure for leakage risk?
It's difficult to answer such specific questions in real time, but I will say yes, as long as the emissions from that are being accounted for, and that you have done the accounting for baseline production for leakage mitigation. But the details of that are going to have to be sorted out in project documentation.
Andrew is asking if there is good evidence to show that production of certain commodities do not lead directly to deforestation, despite what despite of what Global Forest Watch says about the rates. It is possible for a project proponent to make this argument. If not, we would like to propose this as feedback for future new updates. For example, farmers in Ghana are not going to cut down forests to grow tomatoes, and there is research to demonstrate.
Yeah, I think that's feedback that we would be happy to take. And I think I'm not exactly sure where that would fit in, if that's a cross-commodity comment or if that's on the displaced production side. But yeah, if you want to share more information on that specifically, we'd be interested in hearing it.
I think I passed this too quickly. There is about equation 12. Maybe that's something we can address also later. But the question is, how would you predict what the I don't remember in the top of my mind. I don't have the right acronyms here. The FIU, let me see, FMG or FIN would be in 20 years in the displaced area.
Those are values that are going to be, you're going to have to look into for the total carbon stock for SOC. So Emilio, I think we would answer that offline. I'm not exactly sure what the question is.
Yeah, for sure. I already have that in my notes. Laura is asking.
Essentially, those are default
yes.
values. Yeah, they would be
correct. Okay. We have one question here. In South America, grain exporters with a very plastic economy around agricultural production and an effective law protecting forests. Is a national trend and culture around agriculture enough evidence to estimate leakage as de minimis?
I would say unlikely. Yeah, I don't know that that's going to be sufficient documentation that it would be de minimis. I think if there's any sort of production happening in the project, then even if it's unlikely to cause deforestation, we want to be sure that we're accounting for that production and making conservative assumptions about where that production is likely to end up. And so that's the primary function of this module.
Thank you, Spencer. Okay. Yeah, Stephen is, yeah, I think my question is the same as Marcelo's concept. If production of the displaced commodity within the project area will be project due to the increased efficiency of sustainability, is this acceptable? Seems like it would be called cross-commodity production. And I take Spencer's answer to be yes.
Yep, I believe so.
Okay. Great. In our Q&A box, we don't have any more questions unless I miss something. I think I answered a few already. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free to post them now. Yes. Mary, to clarify, how do you choose the default values for land use change? The input type and the management type of your leakage area in 20 years' time. For example, how would you know if the deforested area will be used for intense tilling agriculture or rather plantations?
I think it's just assumed that under any of those scenarios, basically there's an amount of soil carbon loss that would occur, even if there's going to be some there. We're going to assume that it basically goes to zero over, or we're going to assume amount of loss over a 20-year period.
Thank you, Spencer. We have some, a couple of minutes. If anybody has some extra questions. If anybody has any other question, you see our forestcarbon@verra.org address or secretariat@verra.org for this increase. We'll try to make our best effort to answer them as soon as possible. We often receive a lot of inquiries, especially after releases of new versions of methodologies and modules. So, but if you have any other questions, feel free to send us an email.
Yeah, thanks all. Appreciate your time and attention, and like Emilio said, we'll try and get back to you with with any follow-up questions. And yeah, hopefully this revision is helpful, and look for the digitized version. We'll try and push that out, and once that's out, let us know what questions come from that. So thanks again. Appreciate your time. Have a great day.
Thank you.